Good afternoon. How's everybody doing today?
They got cookies.
You got cookies. It can't be bad, right? It is nice to be here. It is nice to see your faces, from chin up. So nice change, at least temporarily. We have some warm weather. We have some sunshine. So things are looking up for us right now. And with that kind of positive spirit, why don't we delve into a dramatic story from antiquity? A story that you might be familiar with, at least some aspects of, but you might not know the details. You might not know all the nitty-gritty of the story. Today, what we're going to be talking about is the Trojan War. Now, how many of you have heard of the Trojan War? How many of you remember in your high school classes slogging through the Iliad? A few of you do. The Iliad, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth later on, tells a story of part of the Trojan War. It's certainly not the entire episode. It's just a tiny part of it. So what we are going to do this afternoon is we're going to talk about the topless towers of Ilium, gods, mortals, and the Trojan War. Now, I want to start off by looking at the title of this talk, the topless towers of Ilium. What does that mean? Where does that come from? Well, again, you might remember your high school history classes. There was an Elizabethan-era poet, a contemporary of William Shakespeare, whose name was Christopher Marlowe. And Christopher Marlowe, one of his great works, was the tragical history of the life and death of Dr. Faustus. And in this story of Dr. Faustus is very ambitious, and he essentially sells his soul to the devil for infinite wisdom and all that sort of stuff. And one of the things that Faustus wants is to see the face of the most beautiful woman in history. And that ties us into the story of the Trojan War. In one part of this tragical history, Faustus asks, "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss. Her lips suck forth my soul, see where it flies. Come, Helen, come, give me my soul again. Here will I dwell, for heaven is in these lips, and all is dross that is not Helena." He is celebrating this mythical beauty, this Helen, whose face launched the 1,000 ships. It's Helen who plays an important role in the start of the story of the Trojan War. And it is here, these topless towers of Ilium, that gives the name to this presentation. Now, what is Ilium? What's a topless tower of Ilium? Well, Ilium was the Greek name for Troy. So the Greeks refer to it as Ilium. The reason why the epic poem by Homer is called the Iliad is because that is the name for Troy that the Greeks gave it. So we start off with some Elizabethan poetry. Now let's jump into the topic. Let's look at the Trojan War itself. And as with any great conflict, historical or otherwise, there has to be a source. There has to be some reason why the war breaks out. So we're going to look at the prologue, the story before the story, if you will. The Trojan War has its origins in a wedding ceremony, the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. Now, Peleus and Thetis were two figures from classical mythology, the deep recesses of Greek history. Thetis was a sea nymph. She was immortal. And Peleus was a Greek hero, a warrior hero. So these two figures are married on Mount Olympus. Mount Olympus is the home of the Greek gods. And all of the Greek gods were invited to this wedding ceremony. We see it depicted here in this very colorful painting. So all of the gods go to this great wedding feast. Everybody's having a good time. They're laughing and they're drinking and they're doing the Macarena and that sort of stuff. Everybody's having a fun time, except there was one goddess who was not invited. A goddess named a goddess named Eris. Eris was the goddess of discord. She was the goddess of trouble. And most of the gods thought maybe we shouldn't invite her to the wedding. That's just bad when she's there, bad things happen. So she was not invited to the wedding, but lo and behold, she finds out. And she is determined to spoil the festivities. So what does this goddess of discord do? she has crafted a golden apple. And inscribed on this golden apple are the words, "To the fairest," to the most beautiful. And she comes into the room where the wedding is being held and throws the apple up onto the middle of the table. And lo and behold, it falls there. All the gods and goddesses look at the apple, "to the most beautiful," and the goddesses start fighting for it. They start clamoring for this apple, which comes to be called the apple of discord. Each of them thinks that they are the most deserving, that they are the fairest, they are the most beautiful of the goddesses. Eventually, most of the participants in this competition withdraw themselves. They fade away. But there are three goddesses who adamantly claim that the apple belongs to them. One is Hera. Who is Hera? She's the queen of the gods. She is Zeus's wife. Zeus, of course, being the king of the gods. The other is Athena. Athena is the goddess of wisdom and the goddess of war. And the third is Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. These three insist that the apple by right belongs to them, that they are the fairest, they are the greatest. So they appeal to Zeus, the king of the gods, and they say, "You have to choose. Who does this apple go to?" Now Zeus, in his long history and all the many myths surrounding him, often makes bad decisions. Well, in this case, he did a wise thing. He said, "I want nothing to do with this. I am not going to make this decision because no matter what I do, two of you are going to be unhappy." So what Zeus decides was that somebody else needed to be the judge. We need to pick somebody who is unbiased, who is unattached, to determine who among these three goddesses is the most beautiful and the most deserving of this apple. Well, what happens? The gods sitting there on Mount Olympus look down over the countryside, and lo and behold, who do they see lounging in a lovely field but a young prince from the city of Troy, a prince by the name of Paris. So the gods decide that Paris would be the one to choose who won this golden apple. So Zeus sends a messenger, the god Hermes, to Paris to say, "Hey, you have to make a decision." And the three goddesses appear before Paris and they say, "Who deserves this apple? Who among us is the fairest?" Now Paris, for his part, saw an opportunity here. And he said, "You know what? I can't decide. All three of you are so radiant. I need to see you individually and talk to you privately behind the bushes over there. And that way you can fully display yourself to me." Very, very sneaky of Paris. So one by one, the goddesses go with Paris behind the bushes and they display themselves to him. And as they are alone, they make him promises. They make him promises of gifts. If he picks them, they will give him unlimited powers. So Hera, and we see Hera displayed over here, accompanied with her peacock. She often has the peacock, goes behind the bushes and shows herself off and promises Paris that he will be, I can't remember what Hera promises him, but some great power, some happiness in life and happiness and wealth in life. Then Athena goes behind the bushes with him and promises him success in war. And finally, Aphrodite goes behind the bushes with him. Aphrodite doesn't even bother to get dressed here. And she promises him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Now, Paris, being young and dumb, says, "I'll go with that." And he decides that Aphrodite should win this golden apple, much to the displeasure of Athena and Hera. So Paris has made some enemies here in this decision. But Aphrodite does win the golden apple. You'll see it being handed to her right there. And Paris is off to win the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Well, who was that most beautiful woman in the world? Her name was Helen. Here we see a 19th century representation of Helen. Now, who was Helen? Helen was actually a Greek queen. She was married to the king of Sparta, a man named Menelaus. And Paris shows up in Sparta. He's a Trojan prince. He is welcomed into the house of Menelaus, great feasting. Helen falls madly in love with Paris. Paris falls madly in love with Helen. This is going to be a problem because Helen's already married to the king of Sparta. Well, what happens? Paris's time in Sparta comes to an end and he prepares to leave. And as he is leaving, as he is packing up his bags to go, he takes a souvenir, I guess we could say. He takes Helen with him. Now, this episode is often referred to as the abduction of Helen, which kind of makes it seem like Paris picks her up, throws her over his shoulders, and walks away with her. But in reality, Helen went willingly. She had fallen in love with Paris because Aphrodite had arranged it. So here we see them fleeing the city of Sparta and returning to Troy. And it is this episode here, this abduction of Helen, that will be the event that sparks the Trojan War, that sparks a war between the Greeks and the Trojans. So from this, we see the outbreak of the Trojan War itself. Now, a couple of things that are important to note about the Trojan War, at least how it is told in the story. One is that it was a dramatically long conflict. According to the myths, the Trojan War lasted for 10 years. The Greeks, when they sail across the Aegean Sea and arrive in Troy, which is located in what is today Western Turkey, encamp and besiege the city for a decade. So it's a very protracted struggle. In order for the Greeks to actually succeed in winning back Helen, who comes to be called Helen of Troy, which is kind of a misnomer, I guess. But in order for them to win back Helen and take her back, there is going to be bloody combat. There is going to be kings and heroes that are fighting and dying on the beach outside of Troy. And it's not just mortals that are involved in the conflict. The gods all play a role in the outcome of the Trojan War. The gods pick sides in this struggle and will participate in some form or another in the combat that ensues. And with this decade-long war, there is, of course, a vast cast of characters. This is a list of some of the more important figures that emerged during the story of the Trojan War. The Greeks and the Trojans had their heroes, had their warriors, had their role players in this epic story. Among the Greeks, some of the most important figures were kings of the various Greek city-states. You had Agamemnon, who was the king of Mycenae. At this time, Mycenae was the most powerful of the Greek cities. He becomes the leader of the Greek expedition, basically the commander of the Greek forces at Troy. He was the brother of Menelaus, the king of Sparta, whose wife has just been stolen by Paris of Troy. Odysseus was the king of Ithaca. Odysseus was considered the wiliest, the most clever of the Greek kings. He ends up with a whole story about himself, which we'll talk about later on. Then you had Achilles. Achilles was a leader of a group called the Myrmidons. And Achilles was the greatest hero of the Greek world. He was undefeated in battle. He was nearly immortal. He was the great warrior hero of the Greeks. You had Ajax, the prince of Salamis, who was the second best Greek warrior, second only to Achilles. There was Diomedes, the king of Argos, and Nestor, the king of Pylos. Now, Nestor was an old man at the time of the Trojan War. He doesn't participate in the fighting directly, but he was seen as kind of the wise guiding figure of the Greeks. He was there dispensing advice to Agamemnon and to others in the midst of the war itself. The Trojans had their own participants in the struggle. Troy at this time was led by a man named Priam. Priam was the king of Troy. Paris, his son, is the guy who kind of starts this entire ordeal. He was a prince of Troy. Another prince of Troy was Hector. Hector was considered the greatest of the Trojan warriors. Almost as good as Achilles, but not quite. Then there was Hecuba, the queen of Troy, Priam's wife. They also had a daughter. Her name was Cassandra. Now, Cassandra is a tragic figure in the epic of the Trojan War. She was blessed by the gods with the ability to foresee the future, but she was cursed by the gods, the fact that nobody would believe her prophecies. So she could see what was going to happen. She would tell people, but nobody would believe her. So she was able to see all of these tragic events, but couldn't really inform people of those. So she had to suffer kind of on her own. There was Sarpedon, another of the great Trojan warriors, who was one of the sons of Zeus. Zeus, again, in his long mythology, has a taste for mortal women, I guess we could say. And he is procreating and creating demigods all over the place. Sarpedon is one of those. And then you have Aeneas, who was a nephew of Priam. Aeneas's role in the Trojan War itself is relatively minor. But in the aftermath of the Trojan War, he becomes a significant figure in the stories related and associated with this. So you have dozens and dozens of characters that all play a role in this epic conflict that is unfolding there, or will be unfolding there on the outskirts of Troy. Now, before the war itself can actually begin, you have Menelaus, the guy whose wife was stolen, turning to his brother Agamemnon and saying, we need to get Helen back. Her theft from me was an assault on my honor, on the honor of Sparta, on the honor of Greece. So Agamemnon calls all the other Greek kings and warriors to form an alliance, basically, to gather their forces together, to gather their ships together, to prepare to sail to Troy on the other side of the Aegean Sea. So what we see happening in eastern Greece is all of these kings, these heroes, these warriors have come together. All of their ships, those 1,000 ships, are anchored there in the water, and the Greeks are just waiting for the wind and the tide to be right so that they can set sail to go to Troy. But there's a problem, as there always is. The problem is that Agamemnon had earlier on offended some of the gods. He had offended the god Poseidon, the god of the sea. It had to do with sacrificing a beautiful bull. Agamemnon liked the bull and kept it for himself and sacrificed a less good bull to Poseidon. Poseidon's all offended by this. But what happens is that the gods prevent the Greek ships from sailing. They basically say, we're not going to give you the wind blowing in the right direction. We're not going to give you the tide flowing in the right direction. So you have all of these Greeks gathered in one spot, waiting and waiting and waiting, and nothing's happening. Well, eventually, Agamemnon and some of the other Greek kings go to visit one of the fortune tellers in Greece. And the fortune teller says, hey, you need to make amends for what had happened with that bull. And the only thing that will make the gods happy is if you, Agamemnon, sacrifice your daughter. So Agamemnon has to make a terrible decision. Do we let this expedition to Troy fail because the winds aren't blowing the right way, or do I sacrifice my daughter Iphigenia to the gods? Eventually, the other kings and warriors put enough pressure on Agamemnon that he says, okay, we have to sacrifice Iphigenia. So he sends a letter back home to Mycenae, to his wife, Clytemnestra, and he says, bring Agamemnon, come to where we are. We have a big surprise in store. He says in this letter that he is going to marry Iphigenia off to Achilles. So it's a great marriage, supposedly. Well, when Clytemnestra and Iphigenia show up, you can imagine their disappointment when Achilles has no idea about this marriage, and instead Iphigenia is taken and sacrificed to the gods. She is sacrificed, the gods are appeased, and the wind starts blowing in the right direction, and the tide starts flowing in the right direction. Everything looks good, except that Iphigenia is dead, and Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, is less than happy with her husband. Now that's important for later on in the story, so just keep that in mind. So what happens? We see the sacrifice here, we see the gods being happy, and the fleet does eventually set sail. There's those 1,000 ships launched by the face of Helen. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Aegean Sea, at Troy, the Trojans were enjoying life. Troy itself was a prosperous, powerful city that dominated the western shore of Anatolia, of modern-day Turkey. Here are some reconstructions of what Troy may have looked like. It was a powerful city surrounded by these stout defensive walls that were supposedly built by the gods Apollo and Poseidon. So those topless towers of Ilium that we see over here were built by the gods. Troy was powerful, it was prosperous, it was a grand city. The Trojans themselves, we see them over here, lived a comfortable existence there on their city overlooking the Aegean Sea. Well, it is here that that giant Greek fleet shows up. And the Greeks land their ships all along this stretch of beach, and the Greeks set up their camp there outside of Troy. And what we see is that the Greeks have come to wage war against the Trojans to take Helen back. For 10 years, the Greeks would be encamped on the beach outside of the city of Troy. And what we see for the first 9.5 years of the Trojan War is epic warfare between Greeks and Trojans. Greek heroes and warriors facing off against Trojan heroes and warriors. And the tide of battle is ebbing back and forth between these two forces. Thousands of men are being killed on the beaches, and the gods are participating in this war. Hera and Athena are supporting the Greeks. Aphrodite and Ares, the god of war, are supporting the Trojans. And every once in a while, when something looks bad for their side, they intervene and kind of turn the tide of battle, and you have this going back and forth. Zeus, for his part, is trying to keep the gods out of this struggle. It's like, let the mortals fight amongst themselves, but the gods don't often listen to Zeus, and they're getting involved, and you have all of this stuff going back and forth. So you see scenes like this playing out there on the beach outside of Troy. Warriors fighting, chariots and horses engaged in combat. This is a very typical motif that we see in Greek art. Greeks fighting against Trojans. It becomes one of those standard images that the Greeks rely on, that the Greeks retell over and over and over again. So for years and years, we see this combat playing out there on the beach outside of Troy. And for much of this, it is a dead heat. The battle is going back and forth. Nobody is really winning. Both sides have victories, both sides have defeats, both sides capture territory and lose territory, and there are atrocities committed by both sides, and there are celebrations by both sides, and really, it doesn't look like anything is happening in a broader picture. This war looks like it will continue and continue and continue. Well, it's at this juncture, in that last year of the Trojan War, that the famous retelling of that conflict has its story. The Iliad, that epic poem credited to Homer, tells a story of about a 9-week period in the 10th year of the Trojan War. So the Iliad itself is only a small part of the bigger story of the Trojan War. Again, here we see Greeks and Trojans in combat, a very, very typical scene. Now, what is the Iliad really about? It's set during the Trojan War. The characters in it are participating in this struggle. But what is the story of the Iliad really talking about? How many of you remember? Not to put you on the spot. Well, the story of the Iliad is basically the tale of Achilles and the anger, the rage of Achilles. Again, Achilles, the greatest of the Greek heroes. Achilles, who was the son of Thetis and Peleus. Remember that wedding at the beginning of our story? He was the product of that wedding. So he was half divine. And he was also nearly immortal. Well, what happens that makes Achilles so angry? Here we see a relatively modern translation of the opening stanza of the Iliad. This is from 1990 by Robert Fagles. And it says, "Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feast for the dogs and birds. And the will of Zeus was moving toward its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles." So the story is about the rage of Achilles. Now, what is Achilles so angry about? What has Agamemnon done to Achilles to make him angry? Well, earlier in the story of the Trojan War, the Greeks had won a victory, and they had conquered some land, and they had taken hostages. Now, as was the tradition in the Bronze Age when these wars were being fought, successful warriors took hostages and also took various forms of booty. And in this case, both Agamemnon and Achilles captured female hostages that they kept as war prizes. Well, as it turns out, the prize, the woman that Agamemnon had taken prisoner, was the daughter of a priest in the temple of Apollo. And basically, fortune started to turn against the Greeks because this daughter of a priest was taken hostage. So the Greeks realized that the only way to kind of change the tide of battle is to have this girl return to her father. The father comes back, begs for her. Agamemnon is convinced, because of losses on the battlefield, to release the daughter, and she goes back with her father, the priest in the temple. But Agamemnon now is feeling dishonored because everybody else has a prize, has taken a young girl as their prize, but he has lost his. So he demands that his honor be restored, and he decides to take the prize, the girl that Achilles had won. Her name was Briseis. Now Briseis was a young, beautiful girl that Achilles had fallen in love with. And yet here comes Agamemnon telling Achilles that he has to give her up. Well, Achilles is irate about this. He is tremendously angry, as you might imagine. And in fact, he contemplates drawing his sword and killing Agamemnon right there on the spot. But Achilles' mother, the goddess, the sea nymph, stops him from doing so and convinces him that he has to let Briseis go to Agamemnon. So Agamemnon takes the prize that Achilles had won, and Achilles is irate and tremendously angry. So what does Achilles do? He withdraws from the fight. He says, fine, you take her, but I am not fighting. Me and my followers are out. And he goes and sits in his tent. His myrmidons go with him. They encamp near their boat, and Achilles is out of the fray. Now this is a big deal because Achilles was the greatest of the Greek warriors, undefeated on the battlefield. And his removal from the fight certainly was not good for the Greek cause. So Achilles is essentially throwing a fit and refuses to fight. Well, what happens to the Greeks? Their fortunes decline because Achilles is not there. Battle isn't going so well, and many of the other Greek warriors and Greek kings begin putting pressure on Agamemnon. Hey, you really should make amends with Achilles. That's going to be playing out in the background of much of the story. In the meantime, however, the fighting continues. And what we see in many episodes of the Iliad is that the fighting that occurs on the battlefield is centered around two heroes or two warriors. The first great episode of single combat that is told in the Iliad involves not Achilles, he's retired, but Menelaus, the king of Sparta, the man whose wife was stolen. In the midst of battle, Menelaus and Paris end up face to face on the battlefield. Now, Paris is the guy who stole Helen of Troy from Menelaus, the king of Sparta. So here we have the two main husband figures, I guess we could say, in the drama of the Iliad. The two men face to face on the battlefield. Now, Menelaus was the much more experienced and much more skilled warrior, and he should have been able to easily dispatch Paris. But what we begin to see is the gods getting involved. So here we have Menelaus, Paris face to face. Paris is throwing his spears, no effect. Menelaus grabs Paris by the helmet and is about to drag him off of the battlefield by his helmet, when miraculously his chin strap breaks and Menelaus ends up holding the helmet, but Paris is laying on the ground. So Menelaus picks up a giant rock and is about to crush Paris with this giant rock. And as he is hurling the rock, as Menelaus is hurling the rock, a cloud envelops Paris, and he is transported away from the battlefield. That cloud was the goddess Aphrodite coming down, shrouding Paris and transporting him from the battlefield up into his bedroom in the palace where Helen is waiting for him. So Paris, really in a lot of the retelling of the Trojan War, Paris doesn't come off so well. First of all, he steals another man's wife. That starts this conflict. And then he is often saved by the intercession of Aphrodite. He is depicted often as sort of a weak figure, a cowardly figure, even at the end of the story. And we'll see when we get there. So Paris does not come off all that well in the story of the Trojan War. Now, you'd imagine that Menelaus here is pretty unhappy about this situation. He could have ended the war right here. He could have defeated Paris and taken his wife back, and that would have been the end of the story. But that doesn't happen because of the intercession of the gods. So there's a lot of frustration on the part of the Greeks after this single combat. But the war continues, the fighting goes on. And the next major episode of battle that we see in the Iliad involved two of the great heroes, the Trojan prince Hector and the Greek warrior Ajax. Again, second only to Achilles. I guess he's number one now because Achilles is sitting in his tent. And what occurs in the battle between Hector and Ajax, displayed here on this Greek vase, is really an epic battle. The two men are equal in strength and they're equal in skill. And they start fighting against each other as the sun is coming up one morning. And they spend all day locked in this single combat. The gods are interceding in this, in that each is acquiring superhuman strength. And they're picking up giant boulders and hurling these giant boulders at each other, things that they could not naturally do. And as the sun begins to go down, you have the Trojans on one side watching this and the Greeks on the other side watching this, and these two men locked in this mortal combat there in the center, equal in strength, equal in skill, and by the time the sun is going down, neither one of them is winning. And both sides, the Greeks and the Trojans, say, enough fighting for now. The sun is going down. This fight is done. And as the day comes to an end, Hector and Ajax, realizing that they have met an equal, embrace each other and exchange gifts and go off to their separate camps. An epic battle that has, again, no real result because the two were equal in combat. But the situation is still pretty dire for the Greeks because though Hector and Ajax have fought to a draw, the Trojans do have an advantage. They have the momentum. And what happens after this battle is that the Trojans, led by Hector and accompanied by others like Sarpedon and even Aeneas in some retellings, launch a surprise assault on the Greek ships. They sneak down the beach and they light some of the Greek ships on fire. This is a dramatic moment in the story. It is a moment when it looks like the Trojans might finally drive the Greeks away. Now, why do the Trojans have success in doing this? Well, what's Achilles doing? He's sulking in his tent, angry at Agamemnon and refusing to participate in this war. So the tide of war is certainly turning against the Greeks. The Trojans are advancing. The Trojans are putting tremendous pressure on the Greek camp. And it's at this moment in the story that Agamemnon sort of swallows his pride, and he decides to ask Achilles to come back into the battle. Though he doesn't do so himself. He sends some ambassadors, some representatives to Achilles' tent to try to convince Achilles to come back. The three representatives that are sent by Agamemnon included Odysseus, who we see over here, again, the wiliest of the Greek kings, Ajax, the second greatest warrior, and another Greek warrior by the name of Phoenix. And they go to Achilles' tent and they plead with him. They beg him to come back into the battle. The tide is turning against the Greeks. The only one who could remedy that situation is Achilles. But Achilles, first of all, is offended that Agamemnon himself hadn't come, and secondly, refuses to go back into battle unless Briseis is returned to him. So this embassy, this mission, fails. Agamemnon will not be moved. Despite the fact that the Trojans are encroaching on the Greek camp, despite the fact that the Trojans have destroyed the Greek ships, Agamemnon will not be swayed into the battle. But one of Achilles' close friends asks for permission to do something. Achilles is accompanied by in some accounts his cousin, some his close compatriot, and most people think his lover, a guy named Patroclus. That's Patroclus lightly dressed there in the background. The two were tremendously close. And Patroclus says, you know, Achilles, we really need you. The Greeks need you in this war. Otherwise, we've been here for 9 years. For what? But Achilles is not moved. So Patroclus comes up with this plan. He says, well, let's do this. Why don't you let me borrow your armor? I will don the armor of Achilles. I will show up on the battlefield in the morning. Everybody will think Achilles has come back to the battle. The Trojans will be terrified. The Greeks will be energized. And we can fight and drive the Trojans back from the Greek camp and the Greek ships. So Achilles says, okay, why don't we do that? You can borrow my armor, but be careful. The only thing you're supposed to do is drive the Trojans back from the camp. Do not chase them up to the walls of Troy. So the next morning, Patroclus puts Achilles' armor on. And here we see a tender moment between Achilles and Patroclus. So the next morning, Patroclus wears Achilles' armor, shows up on the battlefield. The Greeks are excited, the Trojans are terrified, and Patroclus leads the charge against the Trojans, driving them back from the Greek camp, creating a buffer zone between the Greeks and the Trojans. In the midst of this battle, one of the Trojan heroes, Sarpedon, is killed by Patroclus in the midst of battle. Now, this is a famous scene depicting the death of Sarpedon. He's the guy laying there bleeding. Sarpedon, if you recall, was the son of Zeus, the king of the gods. Zeus was upset that his son had died on a battlefield. So he sends down from Mount Olympus two gods. He sends down Thanatos and Hypnos, the god of sleep and the god of death. And they come down to the battlefield to recover the body of Sarpedon, who is brought up to Mount Olympus. His body is cleaned. There are ceremonies held in his honor, and he takes his place as half immortal by his father's side there on Mount Olympus. But this Trojan hero has been removed from the war. Patroclus, excited by his victories and by the fact that he has the Trojans on the run, does not listen to Achilles' advice. And rather than just stopping once the Trojans have fled, he chases them up to the walls of Troy. And that is where Patroclus gets into trouble. Again, everybody thinks Patroclus is Achilles because he's wearing Achilles' armor. And as the Trojans are retreating into Troy, the greatest of the Trojan heroes, Hector, comes out to face who he thinks is Achilles on the battlefield. So you have Patroclus dressed as Achilles facing Hector there in front of the walls of Troy. And what happens in that fight between those two? Well, Hector wins. Patroclus is killed. Of course, when Hector kills him, he thinks he has killed Achilles. So he strips the armor off of the body, takes the armor as a prize, and realizes that's not Achilles. So though he has Achilles' armor, he has not killed Achilles. Achilles, of course, for his part, is heartbroken when he finds out that Patroclus has been killed. Here we see Achilles mourning over the body of Patroclus. And Achilles, now his rage is at a higher degree. He's angry at Agamemnon because of that entire Briseis affair, but now he is vengeful and wants vengeance against Hector and the Trojans. The death of Patroclus forces Achilles back into the battle. He must avenge his friend and his lover. Of course, Achilles has a problem. He doesn't have his armor anymore. His armor has been taken. But luckily, Achilles has a connection. His mother, the goddess, has a new suit, set of armor crafted for her son. The most spectacular armor ever created. Gold and brilliant and really outstanding there. And she brings this to her son. We see that happening over here with Achilles' new armor in this painting. But as she presents the armor to her son, she warns him of his fate, of his destiny. She says, you can take this armor and go back into the battle. And if you go into the battlefield, your name will become glorious, but your life will be very short. If you decide to stay out of the battle, you will lead a long, prosperous, peaceful life, but a life of anonymity. Well, angry, vengeful Achilles decides to go back into the battle. He dons this armor that his mother has made for him and heads out to kill as many Trojans as he can, something he is very, very good at. All the while he is out there slaughtering Trojans on the battlefield, he is looking for Hector, the man who killed Patroclus. Eventually, Achilles and Hector do meet each other in single combat outside the walls of Troy. The greatest of the Trojan heroes and the greatest of the Greek heroes engage in an epic battle as one of the scenes in the Iliad. Again, illustrated here in a Greek vase painting. Achilles over there on the left, Hector over here on the right. You don't really think that Achilles needed armor, but anyway, this battle, this fight between these two great heroes is held outside the walls of Troy on the beach. The Greeks watching from one side of the beach, the Trojans inside the city looking down over the ramparts. Priam and Hecuba up there looking at their son fighting against Achilles. And in this battle, the undefeated Achilles kills Hector. Now, traditionally, when a single combat like this was fought, the victor would strip the armor off of the defeated person, take that as a trophy, and leave the body for proper ceremonials, proper funeral ceremonies to take place. But Achilles is so irate, so angry, and wants so much vengeance against Hector that rather than leaving the body for the proper burial in Troy, he decides to desecrate the body. He ties it to the back of his chariot and rides the chariot around the city of Troy, while the Trojans themselves are watching this horrific sight from the walls. Now imagine Priam and Hecuba seeing their son not only killed on the battlefield, but then his body desecrated like this. And then Achilles takes the body of Hector back to the Greek camp, where he keeps the body as a trophy. Now, normally, a body that was being dragged behind a chariot wouldn't last very long. It would be torn to shreds. But the gods preserve the mortal remains of Hector so that he can eventually have a proper burial. So the body is not decaying, the body is not bruised and battered, and Achilles takes it back and puts it in his tent as a trophy of war. So the greatest of the Trojan heroes is now dead. Now this causes, of course, consternation among the Trojans. And Priam, the king of Troy, is heartbroken that his son will never receive those proper funeral rites. So Priam prays to the gods for help in recovering his body. And one of the gods, the messenger of the gods, Hermes, allows Priam to disguise himself and then transports him to the Greek camp. And there, in the Greek camp, at Achilles' tent, Priam reveals himself to Achilles and begs Achilles for the return of Hector's body. Here we see this depicted in two different scenes, a much more modern scene over here and an ancient Greek scene, with Priam pleading with Achilles. Now Achilles was full of vengeance, was full of animosity toward the Trojans because of the death of Patroclus. But he is so moved by the sorrowful pleading of Priam that he does allow Priam to take Hector's body back to Troy for proper burial. Now, it's at this point, after the visit of Priam to Achilles' tent, that the Iliad itself ends. So we see this brief period in the Trojan War encompassed in that story. But what happens after this? What happens after Hector's body is returned to Troy and has those proper burial ceremonies? Well, in the Greek camp, Achilles holds ceremonial games for the burial of Patroclus. Patroclus has this grand ceremony, and Achilles plays a central role in that. And from this point on, Achilles is once again fully invested in the fight, in the war. And what we see in the aftermath of the Iliad, in later myths and later stories that were told by the Greeks and even the Romans, is that Achilles, his military glory really reaches its peak. So we have more battles, more fights that take place in the aftermath of the Iliad. Now, the Trojans themselves had allies that tried to help them fight against the Greeks. One of the important allies that comes to the assistance of the Trojans was the king of Ethiopia. Ethiopia over there in East Africa. The Ethiopians send a military body to help drive the Greeks away. The king of the Ethiopians was a guy named Memnon. And he shows up on the plains of Troy with his followers. Well, that was a bad idea for Memnon because he faces the wrath of Achilles. And Achilles goes out and he kills Memnon on the battlefield. We see Memnon over here, dressing for battle. The Trojans also had an alliance with the Amazons. Now, who were the Amazons? How many of you have heard of the Amazons? They bring your package in a day. The Amazons were a mythical race of warrior women who probably came from kind of the Ural Mountains, the steppes of Western Asia. And the Amazons come to help the Trojans fight against the Greeks. The Amazon queen was named Penthesilea. We see her over here. And of course, the Amazons fight against the Greeks and they fight against Achilles. And Achilles ends up in single combat with Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons. And what happens? Well, Achilles wins. He is slaughtering Amazons left and right, and he kills Queen Penthesilea. Now, legend has it that as he is plunging his sword into her chest at the end of their battle, he gazes upon her beauty and falls madly in love with her. So there's kind of a tragic twist there. He's destroying the thing he loves. But Achilles is a factor now in the war itself. He is a destructive force in favor of the Greeks, and Trojan fortunes are beginning to wane. The fate of Troy doesn't look so good because Achilles is vengeful and angry and engaged in battle once again. But things happen to Achilles. Now, one of the things about Achilles is that when he was born, his mother took him to the river Styx, one of the rivers that guarded the entrance to the underworld, and dipped him into the river Styx to make him physically invulnerable. However, as she was dipping him into the river, she was holding onto him by his ankle. So he was invulnerable. He could not be hurt except for one weak spot, the one part of his body, his heel, that did not get wet in the river. So he was fearless on the battlefield. He was undefeated on the battlefield because he could not be killed. He could not be hurt, except for that one spot of weakness, his Achilles heel. And that's where we get the phrase or the term Achilles heel. That one vulnerable spot. Well, as it happens, it is that vulnerable spot that would lead to the death of Achilles. As the Greeks are advancing and closing in on the city of Troy, there are some small battles that are being fought. And in one of these battles, Achilles is engaged in a moment of contemplation, a moment of prayer, when who sneaks in behind him but Paris, the prince of Troy, the guy who had started this entire thing. And Paris, armed with a bow and arrow, launches an arrow at Achilles. Now, the arrow itself is guided by the god Apollo, and it is directed right into Achilles' heel. So here we see Paris hiding behind the statue, launching that arrow. It pierces Achilles right in his heel. This is Apollo guiding the direction of that arrow. The arrow strikes Achilles in his only vulnerable spot and kills him. He dies because of this treachery by Paris, again, kind of cowardly sneaking up behind a guy and shooting him in the back, having to have the god direct the arrow to the only vulnerable spot. So Achilles is now out of the scene. The great Greek hero has been dispatched. But the tide of combat really has, by and large, turned against the Trojans. The death of Achilles does stall the Greek advance. And the Greeks are kind of left saying, we don't have Achilles, what are we going to do? How are we going to win this war? Well, it is at this moment that Odysseus, the wisest, the sneakiest, the most wily of the Greek kings, comes up with an idea. He says, we're probably not going to be able to match the Trojans on the battlefield without Achilles, so maybe we should trick them. And what is the plan that Odysseus comes up with?
Horse.
The Trojan horse. He says, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build a giant wooden horse. And we will roll this giant wooden horse up to the gates of Troy. And then all the Greeks will get into their boats and will sail off over the horizon. The Greeks will think, the Trojans will think, hey, they've given up. They've left us this giant trophy and they've gone away. And it will be a moment of triumph, or at least perceived triumph, for the Trojans. The trick was, of course, the horse was hollow. And hiding inside the horse were Greek warriors that were armed. So this giant wooden horse is built. It is rolled up to the gates of Troy. The Greeks get into their boats and they sail away. And the Trojans see this giant wooden horse there outside the gates of Troy and they say, great, the Greeks have run away, they must have given up, they've left us this trophy. So all of the Trojans leave the city to go and inspect this horse. What is this thing? What are we going to do with it? Well, it is here at this episode that Cassandra, the daughter of Priam and Hecuba, blessed and cursed with the gift of prophecy, says, we should destroy this. This is not good for Troy. But Priam and many of the other Trojans say, no, it's obviously a trophy of victory, a symbol of our victory. We should wheel it into the city. So the horse is wheeled into the city. That's what we see going on over here. And the Trojans explode in an ecstasy of celebration. The war is finally over after 10 long years. The Greeks have departed. We are victorious. Troy is saved. And there is feasting and eating and drinking and celebrating all throughout the city of Troy. And people are in such a state of ecstasy that they can't control themselves, and they eventually end up falling down in the streets, drunk and exhausted and happy. And it's at that moment when the Trojans fall asleep, when the city of Troy celebrates to an extreme, that those Greeks that were hidden in the horse exit the horse. They climb down from the horse, they run to the main gates of Troy, they fling open the gates, and the Greeks who had sailed away over the horizon have returned. And the Greek armies come flooding into the city of Troy, and an orgy of destruction takes place. The Greeks massacre civilians in the streets. The city of Troy itself is burned to the ground. And in this very chaotic scene, we can see the Trojan horse right here in the middle. The horse, this ingenious device credited to Odysseus, wins the war for the Greeks. Troy itself is destroyed. The Greeks are victorious. They grab as much booty as they can, taking hostages and taking treasure, and then they go back to their boats and they sail once and for all back to Greece. After 10 long, hard years of struggle, the Greeks are returning to their homeland. Troy no longer exists. The Greeks are victorious. Well, what happens afterwards? What is the epilogue, kind of the ending chapters of the story of the Trojan War? Now, we have to recall that these Greek warriors and kings had been away from home for a decade, and they had left their wives and children back at home. And there may have been some hard feelings among the wives and children, particularly when we look at Agamemnon. Remember what happened at the start of this military expedition with Agamemnon? He had to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia, and his wife, Clytemnestra, was very unhappy about that. While Agamemnon was gone, Clytemnestra had gotten herself a male companion, I guess we could say, a young man by the name of Aegisthus. And when Agamemnon returns, 10 years after leaving his wife, 10 years after sacrificing his daughter, Clytemnestra welcomes him with open arms, but with vengeance in mind. Clytemnestra's temper is made worse by the fact that Agamemnon comes back with Cassandra, the Trojan princess. He has taken her as his booty. So when Agamemnon arrives home, Clytemnestra wants vengeance, wants revenge. And encouraged by Aegisthus, what happens? She murders Agamemnon. Here we see the moment right before it happens. Agamemnon exhausted there in his bed. Here's Clytemnestra holding the dagger in her hand and Aegisthus whispering in her ear, "Go do it. Get rid of him." So Agamemnon is murdered after the Trojan War by his vengeful, spiteful, unhappy wife. Now, the death of Agamemnon does spark an entire other cycle in Greek mythology and in Greek drama. Because Agamemnon and Clytemnestra had other children. One of their kids was named Orestes, and that leads to a cycle of plays and myths called the Oresteia, basically the adventures of Orestes. Another one of their kids was Electra, another daughter. So there's an entire series of plays and stories around her. Basically what happens is that Orestes will avenge his father and ends up murdering his mother and her lover. And, you know, Greek stories are really fun. These ancient Greek stories are very, very complex in the relationships. But Agamemnon is dead after 10 years of warfare and finally defeating the Trojans. He's killed in his bed. What about Odysseus, the wiliest, the sneakiest, the most clever of the Greeks? What happens to him? Well, after the sack of Troy and the success of his Trojan horse, he and his men get on their boats and begin to sail back to Ithaca. Now, Ithaca is on the far western side of Greece, so he has a little bit longer journey than some of the other Greek kings and heroes. But Odysseus gets into trouble. He has offended some of the gods, and his what should be a relatively short trip home gets complicated. And he ends up spending 10 years wandering the Mediterranean, trying to get from Troy to Ithaca. His GPS was clearly not working here. During this voyage, this odyssey, named after Odysseus, he sees his crews and his ships slowly being destroyed by natural catastrophes and by the actions of the gods. He is tempted by the sirens, who are trying to lure his ship onto the rocks to be crushed there. He spends time with the witch, her name is Circe, who falls madly in love with him and tries to prevent him from leaving by turning all of his men into pigs. literal pigs, not human pigs. He has to escape from the Cyclops, Polyphemus. And he has to trick Polyphemus in order to escape. So he goes through all of these adventures. He faces the Scylla and the Charybdis, an infamous whirlpool and rocks that were known to destroy ships. And he is wandering throughout the Mediterranean. And after 10 years of warfare, it takes him another 10 years to get home to Ithaca, where he finds his wife Penelope waiting for him. Now, when Odysseus gets home, he finds Penelope, who has been loyal to her husband. He finds his son, who is fully grown, and he finds his palace full of suitors, men who want to marry Penelope, because they figure it's been 20 years, this guy's never coming back. So Odysseus arrives in Ithaca, and of course he's gone through all these ordeals. He doesn't have any men with him. He's all ragged, and he's got this long, nasty beard, and nobody recognizes him at Ithaca, except for his dog. The dog that he had left behind 20 years before waited for the return of the master, sees him, and runs up to him, sniffs at him, wags its tail, and the dog drops dead. The poor dog, right? But Odysseus has returned from this 20-year adventure and then arrives in the palace and reveals himself to his son, reveals himself to his wife, and clears out all the suitors and reestablishes himself as the king of Ithaca. And that brings us to the last character I want to talk about in the aftermath of the Trojan War, the Trojan prince Aeneas. Again, a very minor figure in the Iliad and in the Trojan War itself. But at the end of the Trojan War, as Troy is being destroyed, Aeneas manages to escape. He flees the burning city, carrying his father, Anchises, on his shoulders, accompanied by his wife and child. They sneak out of the city, they get into a boat, and they sail away from Troy. Now, like Odysseus, Aeneas would spend about a decade wandering the Mediterranean. It's funny that they never cross paths in their various stories. But he eventually ends up on the west coast of Italy, at the mouth of the Tiber River, and there establishes a settlement that will mythologically become the forebearer of Rome. The Romans create this story of Aeneas and his voyage called the Aeneid, and they are the ones who create their lineage going back to Aeneas. So this figure becomes important in the story of the rise of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. The Romans trace their origins to Aeneas. Some of his descendants were twin brothers named Romulus and Remus, who actually go and establish the city of Rome, in the 9th century. So we see various figures from the epic of the Iliad, from the story of the Trojan War, who have kind of a exciting afterlives from the war. Agamemnon's not so exciting. He doesn't stick around for very long. But what comes from Agamemnon's death, certainly important stories in Greek literature and in the Western canon. And that, with Aeneas escaping from Troy, is really the end of the saga of the Trojan War. One of the great stories of antiquity. Now, it does bring us to a very important question. Is this real? Did the Trojan War actually happen? The short answer is no, at least not in the way it was told here. There is no evidence, no historical evidence, no archaeological evidence that there was a Greek army encamped around Troy for 10 years. Now, was there a city of Troy? Yes. In fact, there were 9 of them, built one on top of another over a long period of history. Archaeologists think that Troy 6 might have been the one that was around during the Trojan War. There is certainly evidence of destruction of the city, but again, you have 9 Troys, one on top of one another. Now, is it possible that the Greeks and the Trojans at one time fought each other? Sure, it's actually probable, because they were both powers on either side of the Aegean Sea, probably competing for influence, competing for trade, competing for resources on the various islands in the Aegean. It's not unlikely that the Greeks and the Trojans did have conflict. But was it this epic conflict involving immortal heroes and gods and all of that sort of stuff? I'm betting against that. But it is an exciting story. The tale of the Trojan War, as we have it recounted by Homer, by other myths and other authors, really is one of the great stories of antiquity, one of the great stories in world literature. And that is the end of my discussion. Does anybody have any questions?
What happened to Helen?
What happened to Helen? She actually ends up going back to Sparta with her husband. And they supposedly have a fine relationship after that. I don't know, I'd be a little bit angry at her if I were Menelaus, but after 10 years of warfare, I guess you kind of have to take her back. So, yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, thanks a lot.